Now, none of that is of interest to Senator Ron Johnson, of course, because he would rather portray those of all races who dare to seek racial justice as the villains and not the MAGA mob who tried to overturn an election. For more, I'm joined by Angela Rye, former executive director and counsel for the Congressional Black Caucus, and former FBI special agent Clint Watts. Clint, I'm going to start with you because there's a long history of people like Ron Johnson pretending that civil rights was actually a conspiracy to hurt or kill white people. That's the way that it worked in the 1960s when J. Edgar Hoover, sort of a pre-Ron Johnson, sicked the FBI on people like Dr. King, on civil rights activists, claiming that they were conspiring, and often there were anti-Semitic sort of relations to that too, conspiring with Jewish communists to trick black people into thinking they wanted equality. How is what Ron Johnson's doing any different than that?
Well, it's fascinating, Joy. In September of 2019, I testified to the committee that Senator Ron Johnson was on. And what he was most concerned about was that there was no discussion of his extremism as being right-wing. That was his big concern that day. He just saw it as there are extremists out there, and let's talk about all sides of it. That was the entire point of his lecture that day. Yet you could point to it and say, well, they are wearing Donald Trump hats. You would think that was logical, that that's what it was. So it's a 2-year campaign to essentially try and create some equivalency, which is not there. There's no evidence to support it. And at the same time, this is somebody who is providing oversight, by the way, of the Department of Justice, providing oversight of something like the Department of Homeland Security, providing oversight of what is a very dangerous phenomenon, which is local law enforcement members having dual membership with a lot of these groups. Essentially, we see white supremacists, government militias. That is where we can't have effective law enforcement that's equal for all people in America.
You know, and another way to look at it, Angie, is that he's trying to undermine the investigation because he, like Donald Trump, sees these people as part of his base. You've got all the way back to Charlottesville. The only time you saw Antifa was when they were getting in fistfights with Nazis. That's when you saw Antifa. We haven't really seen them since. But you can go all the way through Michigan, these same right-wing kinds of groups that say they're going to kidnap the governor. You can go all the way through the Boogaloo Boys who attacked. Let me show some video to our audience if people don't remember this. This is cut 3 for my producers. Remember this? This was at a Black Lives Matter protest where you had a guy, this is in Minneapolis, this is during the George Floyd protests, and the person who's breaking glass and starting trouble, and we saw so much of this, were not Black Lives Matter people who were filming this guy, another right-wing guy. He finally gets identified. He's a white supremacist. This kind of libel against Black Lives Matter, in your view, Angela, what is the point of it?
Well, it's the traditional boogeyman strategy, Joy, right? We know from ages of political strategy that there always has to be a bad guy. And in this instance, it is the labeling of Black Lives Matter as Antifa, as communist, as inherently dangerous as black, right? Like black in and of itself is the boogeyman in this country. And so you see that whether we call them dog whistles or foghorns now, when they say things like, well, I know they're patriots and they love this country, now that is all of the sudden code for domestic terrorists, MAGA hat wearers, and Confederates. You saw all of those flags, the Trump 2020 flag interchanged with the Confederate flag, substituted for an American flag on the Hill that day on January 6th. And so for Ron Johnson to say, you know, he wants to talk about riots, well, then let's talk about riots. Let's talk about how police officers would turn a blind eye to what happened on Capitol Hill, would turn a blind eye to racial uprising and riots from domestic terrorists who look more like Ron Johnson than look like me or you, Joy. Let's talk about riots, and let's talk about the outcome from those riots. But most of all, let's talk about what it means to really protect Black lives in this country and stop with the dangerous labeling. That's what we really need to talk about.
You know, and Angela, to stay with you for a moment, I mean, you were talking to people that day, the day of the January 6th insurrection, people you knew, staffers. Did any of them report to you that Ron Johnson walked out and met those protesters and talked to them? Because I also think he's a bald-faced liar. He was scared with everybody else and running with everybody else. As far as I can see, he was running, not standing there and having a little elocution with his friends.
Yeah, no, Joy, and I think the reality of it is so many of them did not know what was going on. They knew who was there, But, there is this convenient misremembering of what actually happened. And now the fact that these folks were patriots and they were just upset, and I wanted to go out there and say, I feel your pain. No, you didn't, because you didn't know who was coming in, how they were getting in, and there were a whole lot more Eugene Goodmans around that helped to save people like Senator Ron Johnson and many of his colleagues. It didn't matter what party you were that day. People just were trying to survive and figure out what was going on, whether you were on the Republican side of the aisle or you were on the Democratic side of the aisle. Everybody got the same alerts from their cell phones telling them to shelter in place, to stay right where they were, because they didn't know when these folks or how these folks were going to get in the building. That's the truth. So he can have whatever kind of convenient memory he wants, but the truth is racism is as racism does, and that's exactly what it did on January 6th.
Clinton, let's talk about, indeed, Clinton, let's talk about this investigation. 900 search warrant, 15,000 hours of surveillance and body camera footage, 210,000 tips, 80,000 witness interviews, 300 suspects charged. This is like the largest investigation that we have seen in modern U.S. history. In your view, how far does this go? You just were doing a long tweet about the really lengthy investigation about Russian attacks on our election. We got a lot of detail. Are we going to get this kind of forensic detail on this, do you think, ultimately?
I do, Joy. One of the funniest things about this scenario is for these perpetrators is they're also the anti-mask perpetrators. So there's an overwhelming body of evidence of the acts that they committed. I mean, we know who they are. We figure it out over time. The other thing that you're starting to see from the FBI's criminal complaints that they're lodging is they are using evidence that is being gathered from other people that are being arrested, from other search warrants that they're doing, and electronic surveillance. So you're matching up all of the threads of evidence now. This is how you build towards a conspiracy case. We also see in several cases, particularly the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, two investigations that already seem to be scaling, meaning that there's communication, resourcing, coordination. You're seeing all the elements that could be a broader conspiracy case. I think the next part is that this will go on for months. Watching the public reaction, yes, they want justice. For the FBI to do this many arrests in such a short period, to go through that many thousands of hours of footage, to go all around the country and just identify these people where they're at, arrest them, bring them in. I can't imagine a caseload that has been larger any time in U.S. history, really, than what they have to manage right now. Even after 9/11, a devastating attack, lots of evidence recovery, you still were looking for 19 hijackers. In this case, the FBI and all the state and local law enforcement are looking for thousands of Americans ultimately to try and bring them to justice. So I know America wants this to come to fruition, but I think they'll be patient. This will go on at least the rest of the year, I would imagine.
Yeah. Let me play Chris Wray, the FBI director. He testified last year about the threat of white nationalist terrorism, and this is what he said.
What I can tell you is that within the domestic terrorism bucket category as a whole, racially motivated violent extremism is, I think, the biggest bucket within that larger group. And within the racially motivated violent extremist bucket, people ascribing to some kind of white supremacist type ideology is certainly the biggest chunk of that.
Just a real quick response from both of you. We're short on time, but Clint Watts, first to you and then to Angela. How prepared is the federal government, do you think, for this threat going forward from your point of view, Clint, and also from your point of view, Angela? How prepared are Black Lives Matter and Black Voters Matter related groups? Because you're not just confronting people who don't want people to vote. They're actually confronting violence and potentially deadly violence. So, Clint, you first.
Across the FBI, I'm sure the federal government, DHS, they're over capacity. Now they have to investigate a crime that happened on January 6th while also trying to preempt a scattering and reshaping white supremacist and anti-government and conspiracy-based domestic terrorism threat. There are not enough resources to do both of those at the same time, and they probably could use a lot of support from the Senate Homeland Affairs Committee that keeps dragging them out there to testify.
Angela? Just really quick, what I would say to you, Joy, is there's a role that the government has to play in preparing these groups who are doing the work of the Lord, trying to ensure that people can vote, that people can survive, and that people can thrive in this country, the folks who built this country. And so what we really need to see is a response from local, state, and federal law enforcement by info sharing. And the same people, right, who were on Capitol Hill on January 6th, that means that some of them can't be a part of law enforcement agencies because they're not sharing information to the good and for the protection of these groups who do the work every day. They're actually sharing that information to cause harm. You saw that as Exhibit A on January 6th. And so in addition to information sharing and coordination with all of those government entities, they have to get people in there who have the right intention. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. Angela Rye, Clint Watts, thank you both very much. Appreciate you.